The smell of tar and salt cod, wood smoke from 1,000 chimneys, the sound of soldiers drilling on the common while printers set type in defiance 3 streets away. Boston in 1774 was a city of 16,000 people living under military occupation, but occupation is not the right word. The troops were there to keep order. The problem was that Boston had decided order was no longer acceptable. This was a port city that had grown rich on trade and now found itself taxed by a parliament it had no voice in, a city where merchants kept ledgers and militias kept powder dry, where loyalty was a question with no safe answer. Welcome to Boston on the edge of 1775, a city that had not yet chosen revolution, but was running out of reasons not to. Boston sat on a peninsula, nearly an island, connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of land. The harbour opened to the east, the Atlantic beyond. The city had been there for more than a century, built by Puritans who believed in order, work, and the watchful eye of God. By 1774, the Puritan discipline remained, but the certainty had cracked. The streets were narrow, winding, unplanned. Wood frame houses pressed close together, their clapboard sides grey with weather and smoke. Brick chimneys rose everywhere. The smell of cooking fires, of waste, of animals kept in small yards. The streets were not well paved, mud in the low places after rain, cobblestones where merchants had paid for improvements, carts, horses, people on foot, apprentices running errands, women carrying baskets, children weaving through the crowds. The city was dense, loud, and increasingly restless. You could feel it in the way people moved, in the way conversations stopped when strangers approached. Something was building, and everyone knew it. The waterfront was the reason Boston existed. Long Wharf stretched nearly half a mile into the harbour, wide enough for warehouses on both sides. Ships tied up along its length, unloading timber, molasses, rum, fish. The trade that had made Boston wealthy. The harbour smelled of salt and tar and the rot of low tide. Sailors and stevedores worked with rope and muscle, hauling barrels, crates, sacks of grain. Shipwrights shaped hulls in open yards. The rope walks ran along the water, long, low buildings where men twisted hemp into the endless coils of line a ship required. Hard work, hot work, the kind that built fortunes for others. But the wharves had become contested ground. Customs officials stood at the docks, inspecting cargo, checking manifests, looking for goods that had not paid the Crown's taxes. The inspections were thorough. The taxes were resented. Tea, molasses, paper, glass. Everything that passed through the port carried a levy that flowed to London, not Boston. The merchants kept 2 sets of books, one for the inspectors, one for themselves. Smuggling was not a crime in Boston. It was an economic necessity, and in the taverns near the docks, men spoke openly about what might happen if the Crown kept tightening its grip. Walk into the streets and the texture of the city becomes clear. Shops crowded together, a silversmith's sign overhead, a printer's, the smell of ink drifting through open windows, bakers, tailors, rope makers, coopers. Every trade had its place. Apprentices learned under masters who expected long hours and silent obedience. Merchants lived above their shops, keeping close watch over their goods and their accounts. Near the waterfront, Faneuil Hall stood as the city's market and meeting place, its brick walls echoing with commerce and debate. Up the hill, the old State House rose above King Street, seat of colonial government, watched over by soldiers and resented by nearly everyone else. At the north end, the Old North Meeting House gathered the faithful and the furious in equal measure. These were the landmarks of a city that had not yet decided what it would become. The market was a press of bodies. Women sold butter, eggs, vegetables from farms beyond the city. Prices had climbed. Imported goods carried tariffs that made them expensive. Local goods were scarce. Shortages bred resentment, and resentment bred talk. In the corners of the market, black Bostonians, enslaved and free, worked as labourers, as servants, as skilled tradespeople. Their presence was essential, their status precarious. The law offered little protection. The economy depended on their work, but the society barely acknowledged it. Women worked everywhere. running taverns when husbands were at sea, managing shops, taking in laundry, sewing, baking for sale. Children worked by 7 or 8. Errands, apprenticeships, hauling water, tending fires. Boston was not a gentle city, it was a working city, and work was what kept it alive. The taverns were where the city's real business happened. The Green Dragon, the Bunch of Grapes, the Salutation. Dark, low-ceilinged rooms thick with pipe smoke and the smell of rum. Men gathered after work, after meetings, sometimes during work. News moved through the taverns faster than it moved through official channels. A ship arrived with word of a new tax, a court ruling, troops landing in Halifax. Within hours, the taverns knew. The talk was not always quiet. There were men who spoke openly of resistance, of natural rights, of a government that had lost its claim to obedience. The arguments grew heated. Voices rose, but when a stranger walked in, the room went quiet. Trust was scarce. Informers were everywhere. The taverns were also where printing happened, in back rooms and basements. Boston had newspapers, the Massachusetts Spy, the Boston Gazette, pamphlets, broadsides, handbills printed and distributed before the authorities could stop them. Words that would have been treason a generation earlier were now set in type and sold openly. The presses were watched, but they kept running. Ideas, once printed, could not be unprinted. They moved from hand to hand, street to street, town to town. Information was currency, and in Boston, the supply was abundant. The soldiers were everywhere, red coats and white crossbelts, muskets with fixed bayonets. They had been garrisoned in the city for years, occupying public buildings, billeted in homes when space ran short. The official reason was order, protection from unrest. But no one in Boston believed it. The soldiers were there to enforce the king's will, to remind the city that defiance had consequences. They drilled on the common, marching in formation, drums beating, a display of discipline meant to intimidate. They patrolled the streets in small groups, watching, waiting. The presence of soldiers changed everything. Men measured their words in public. Tavern talk grew cautious when a red coat entered. Women avoided them. Children threw stones and ran. There were incidents, a shove, an insult, a punch. Nothing that made it into official reports, but everything that made the pressure worse. The city and the soldiers existed side by side, but not together. The divide was absolute, and both sides knew that eventually something would give. Churches and meetinghouses were the moral framework of the city. Boston had been built by Puritans, and the architecture of their faith still shaped daily life. Sunday services were expected. Attendance was noted. Sermons were long, dense with theology and civic instruction. Ministers navigated a narrow line. Some preached obedience to lawful authority, urging patience and submission to the crown. Others spoke of conscience, of higher laws, of the duty to resist when earthly power overstepped its bounds. The sermons were heard carefully, remembered, repeated. The meetinghouses were also where town meetings happened, where decisions were made, debates held, votes taken. Power in Boston was not held by a governor alone. It was shared, contested, argued over in rooms full of men who believed they had a right to be heard. That belief, more than anything, made the city ungovernable. The British could station troops, they could impose taxes, they could arrest printers, but they could not make Boston obey. Night fell and the city changed. Few street lamps, candles in windows if you had them. The watch began its rounds, men with lanterns and staves calling the hours, checking doors, looking for fire. Fire was the constant fear. Wood buildings, open flames, narrow streets. A spark could take a block. Buckets were kept ready. Neighbors watched for smoke. In the darker parts of the city, near the docks, the night was looser. Sailors on leave, laborers drinking, women working. The watch avoided those streets unless they had to. Crime happened. Theft from ships, fights outside taverns, houses broken into after dark. Boston at night was not lawless, but the law was thin. And in a city under this much strain, darkness made everything more dangerous. Men met in secret, plans were made, powder was moved, weapons were hidden. The night was when the city prepared for what it knew was coming. Boston, in 1774, was a city that had run out of room to compromise. It had trade, it had institutions, it had laws and churches, and a functioning civic order. But it also had soldiers in the streets and taxes it had not voted for. It had printers who would not stop printing and merchants who would not stop smuggling. It had taverns full of dangerous talk and meetinghouses full of dangerous ideas. The people of Boston were not revolutionaries yet. They were trying to make livings, raise families, survive. But they were also done pretending that the old arrangement still worked. The system that had governed them for a century had become intolerable, and intolerability, given enough time, becomes action. The break had not come yet, but the city was ready. You could feel it in the way men looked at soldiers, in the way women refused to buy taxed goods, in the way children learned to run messages no adult would carry. Boston was waiting, and when it finally moved, the sound would carry across an ocean. I hope you enjoyed your walk through Boston in 1774. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe for future videos.